Anita Greenbaum Brush, and I'm here to present our second virtual Gombin talk on the interwar years in Poland and in Gombin specifically. This was really the time when there was the last generation of a Jewish community in Poland and certainly in Gombin. And I think that causes us to look back on this time as a time either we look at it through the rosy glow of tradition or with the bitterness of anti-Semitism. But really, it was a time when there was tremendous growth and change, both in Poland as a whole and Gombin specifically. And that's the program that I hope to tell you about. I'm going to start with a personal story. When I was in college, I found a book in a bookstore about pre-war Poland. It depicted mostly very traditional Jews in impoverished settings. And really, it was my image of what I thought Poland was like. But when I gave it to my father, he reacted surprisingly and said, "That's not the Poland that I know. The Poland that I know was changing and modernizing." And that's what I want to try to present to you today. I want to tell you a word about two of the sources that I used in preparing this program. One is the excellent history of Gombin Jews, written by Magdalena Karsajewski. And you can read that in its entirety on our website. You can read it in English in its entirety because it's been translated by a member, Leon Zamosh. Another book that I used extensively is the book called Awakening Lives. Awakening Lives takes 15 autobiographies written by Jewish youths in the 1930s. They wrote these biographies for a contest for the YIVO Institute because the YIVO Institute wanted to study the lives of Jewish young people in Poland. There were really 600 of these autobiographies written, and about 300 have been saved and are at the YIVO Institute in New York. But 15 of them have been translated into English, and it's a fascinating book. I'm going to transition to my PowerPoint, so just give me a minute. I call this program The Jews of Gombin in Poland During the Interwar Years, Change, Hope, and Loss. It was a time of tremendous change, a time of modernizing and secularizing. And this engendered a lot of hope, especially in young people. We all know that it ended in tremendous loss, but during the 20s and 30s, there was also tremendous hope. One of the big reasons for change is that after World War I, Poland became an independent country once again. In the previous 125 years, Poland had been partitioned 2 or 3 times by the great empires surrounding it. Gombin was part of the Russian Empire, was part of the area called Congress Poland or Congress Russia. And that is why so many documents that people look for are written in Russian. After World War I, there were new Polish borders created. It isn't the Poland that we know today. The whole country was moved eastward so that there were big cities like Vilnius and Lvov were part of Poland at that time. Now the Polish borders are moved much further west. As soon as it became an independent country, Poland went to war with the Soviet Union, trying to establish its eastern border. And there were also skirmishes with Germany, trying to establish the western borders. And you can see that there were two parts of Germany on either side of what was known as the Polish corridor. Poland was a new country that was made up of 1/3 of ethnic minorities. There were Jews, Ukrainians, and Germans. Minorities in the new constitution were granted protection rights. They were granted equal rights and cultural autonomy. But at the same time, there was tremendous tension from nationalists who intensified their efforts to undermine the rights of minority groups and to promote a policy of Polonization. What did independence mean? I'm going to tell this story somewhat through the lens of my family. Here's a picture of my father, Chaim Greenbaum, and his sister, Rosa, in Warsaw in 1937. Jews served in the military of a newly independent Poland. In fact, as soon as it started, they went to war with the Soviet Union. Jews had served in the military in Russia before. Jews and others could be drafted for a period of up to 25 years. And this was one of the reasons why so many people left Poland in that period. The new Polish Republic meant that politics became a passion. I can't emphasize this enough. There was a plethora of parties, not just Jewish parties, but Polish parties or multi-ethnic parties. The main Jewish parties were as follows. Agudat Israel represented the Orthodox community. They stood for tradition. They stood for following the authority of the government and for the synagogue kahila, the board that represented the synagogue. They resisted secularization and the use of Hebrew as a modern language. The Bund was a socialist workers' party, a Jewish socialist workers' party. Although they were often aligned with other socialist parties, they felt that Jews had unique needs and that they should be recognized as a national minority with Yiddish as their language. They felt that Jews should stay and be integrated into Poland, however. Zionists, on the other hand, worked for the emigration of Jews to Palestine. The Zionists were very divided amongst themselves. There were Orthodox Zionists and right and left-wing Zionists and revisionist Zionists. Sometimes parties formed coalitions and other times they stood independently. The Jews of Gombin voted for these Jewish parties and consistently held about 1/3 of the seats in the municipal council. They were able to get along with most of the other parties in Gombin, but frequently clashed with NDEC, which was a nationalist party. But political parties were far more than just a party that you voted for. And especially for young people, parties became a second home. Here we see the youth group of Hashomer Hatzair, the Zionist youth group, and in the other picture, the Bundist youth group, Zukunft, the future. Party youth movements hope to prepare members for a new and better life. And to that end, they organize scouting groups, sports clubs, hiking, singing, and lectures. And here we see larger groups, again, of the Bundists and the Zionists in Gombin. Here are the sports clubs. The Bundist Morgenstern Club was said to excel in gymnastics, while the Maccabee Soccer Club excelled in soccer. Now, there were clubs with the same names all over Poland. So the Bundists, wherever they played, were the Morgenstern Club, and the Maccabees, wherever they played, were the Zionist Club. They competed against each other and with clubs from other towns, and even sometimes against non-Jewish clubs, but this could be dangerous. Independence meant that education moved beyond the cheder. Now, my father told me stories about being a cheder student. He said that the rebbes were very hard and beat them with cat-of-nine-tail whips. And as soon as he could, he ran away from the cheder and to the public school that opened in Gombin. In 1920s, there were 4 public schools that opened in Gombin that were supported by the municipality. And students in each one were grouped by religion. The reason they were grouped that way was because of the Minorities Protection Treaty, which guaranteed that ethnic minorities could be educated in their own languages. There was really a multiplicity of different educational forms throughout Poland, as everyone started to recognize the need for a more secular education. So there was all this combination of hybrid models. Later in the 30s in Gombin, there was a multi-ethnic high school and a vocational school. There were 2 kindergartens in Gombin. One was run by the Zionists and one by the Bundists. The Bundist kindergarten taught in Yiddish, and the Zionist kindergarten taught in Hebrew. School brought many new opportunities. Jewish schools had to offer 10 to 12 hours of instruction in Polish on Polish subjects. And I expect that that means studying Polish literature and Polish history. One of the writers of the autobiographies wrote, "We studied natural science, geography, the history of our country, world history, physics, and chemistry." There were also other opportunities. The picture of the mandolin orchestra is one I've seen from other communities. So I imagine that it was a very popular thing to do. And here is Rosa in 1930 as she looked at the masked ball at primary school number 2. Some students had to leave Gombin to go to school. In the 1920s, my father went to high school in the nearby city of Plotzk, which was about 15 miles away. This was very common. Many of the autobiographies describe young students leaving their town and going to a nearby city. They sometimes lived at the school or lived with other Jewish families. Students also started to study at the university for the first time in the 20s, but there were limits on what was available due to a quota system which restricted the number of students that could attend university or enter professions. Many students were forced to go abroad. This is what happened to my father, who, despite going to a gymnasium in Warsaw, which was a preparatory school for university, he was not admitted to the university and left to attend school in France. Employment in Gombin continued much as before. There were still the weekly markets, and the primary employment was in trading for fruits and grain and in small manufacturing, tailoring, watchmaking, tinsmithing, particularly making shoe uppers and caps. There were small oil and seltzer factories, a sawmill, and a tannery. One thing I learned from reading the autobiographies is that even in small towns with small manufacturing plants, which only employ 2 or 3 people, there might be 20 tailor shops or leatherworking shops within a community. And the employees would leave after a long day and join a guild or a union meeting. Many of the unions were set up by the political parties. And so groups of tailors or leather workers would meet to study and to participate in union work. The 30s saw an economic downturn in Poland, as elsewhere, and a consequent rise in class consciousness. There was a boycott of Jewish businesses. When we were in Gombin in 2018, the man pictured above, Jan Yedorovsky, came and talked to our visiting group. And he told us that as a boy in the 30s, he had scrawled on Jewish shops, "Don't shop here." He told us this with tears in his eyes and asked our forgiveness. The 30s was a time of terrible economic deprivation. There was great unemployment and low pay. And in many of the towns, there was no safety net. Some of the autobiographies describe families giving up their business, giving up their homes, and living virtually on the street, or groups of families squatting in an unused fortress. In Gombin, there was a safety net. There were 2 shelters, one for Poles and one for Jews. And there were several Jewish loan associations. But that wasn't enough to meet the need, because you had to be able to guarantee that you could pay back the loan to the loan association. And so in the 1930s, the emigre community set up a new bank, the Gemilet Hasadim Bank, which established no or low interest loans. The name of the bank means bestowing kindness. And I have to say, it's the nicest name for a bank I've ever encountered. But the poverty that existed gave rise to a new class consciousness. And this is what one of the writers of the autobiographies wrote. The very first lecture that I heard opened up a new world for me. I learned that humanity was divided into 2 classes, the hungry and the full, those who labor and those who do not, who do nothing. Young people during these years were passionate about reading, studying, and bettering society. And that led to the vital importance of libraries. Towns set up libraries, political groups set up libraries, unions set up libraries. Here's a description of one of the libraries in Gombin. The library started with around 2,000 volumes. The association, however, did not focus only on lending and borrowing books. They organized educational courses for the young, and later they sponsored a drama circle, presented plays, concerts, and organized open lectures by well-known guest speakers. I want to say a word about the book pictured here, Jean-Christophe. In the autobiographies, this is the book that comes up over and over and over as described by young people. It was a book that won the Nobel Prize in 1915. It's a book in 10 volumes, and it describes the life of Jean-Christophe from birth to death. I think the reason it was so popular is that young people identified with Jean-Christophe's passion, but also the difficulties that he encountered in his life. I'm familiar with this book because when I was a teenager, it was one of the books that my father recommended to me. "1937 brought visits from two returning Gombiners. The first was a visit by Sam Rafel. Sam had been an emigre, but he made many trips back to his native town of Gombin, bringing money that he raised from the larger emigre community. But in 1937, he also brought a movie camera, and he took movies of his hometown. And in the movie, you can see modern Jews and traditional Jews. It gives us an image of pre-war life. And the movie is now at the U.S. Holocaust Museum, but you can see it on the Gombin Society website. Also in 1937, my father returned, and he gave a lecture on conscious parenthood or birth control. In the lecture, he gave out booklets in Polish and in Yiddish about the reproductive system and created a calendar that people could use to determine fertile and infertile periods. The interwar years saw new cultural pursuits. In Gombin, the drama circle and movies. The drama circle was very active in Gombin. They put on plays at the Polonia Theater that had many costumes and background. They put on many plays. Also, movies were shown at the Polonia Theater. And my Aunt Rose remembers that when silent films were shown, she would play the piano to accompany the films. I want to say a word about how vibrant the newspaper and magazine world was in Poland. There were 3,000 Jewish newspapers and magazines published in Poland just prior to World War II. Every political, cultural, and literary organization seemed to have its own newspaper. In Warsaw alone, there were 130 Jewish publications. What did people do for fun? Here are some charming pictures from my family archive that I don't know much about. They clearly show my father and friends in a rural setting around Gombin. Now, I know that many of the political groups organized farm stays, or time in the country so that young people could prepare themselves for a new and different life. I'm not sure what these pictures represent, but it was clear that I've seen my father and several of his friends in them over and over again. Here's something else that Gombiners enjoyed, and that is spending time in the woods in hammocks. Gombin is surrounded by pine woods on two sides, and people clearly prepared themselves and went to the woods with a hammock and spent time there. You can see family groups and friend groups. There were also obviously photographers there and took many pictures. The 30s saw a rise in nationalism and anti-Semitism. Polish fascists attacked Jews and Jewish property. Many of the autobiographies describe Jewish students who were studying in a town and were set upon by hooligans with clubs. There were bench ghettos, which restricted where Jewish students could sit in class. And the Polish government denounced the Minorities Treaty, limited the kosher slaughter of animals, and approved the boycott of Jewish businesses. In my own family, Rose was deeply affected by the rise in nationalism and anti-Semitism. A comrade of hers was killed, and she wrote this poem in his memory. Honor and praise his memory. The poisoned bullets of the fascists cut down your young life. My conclusion about the years, the interwar years, is that for young people, it was a very difficult time in many ways, but it led to lives really filled with passion for reading and learning, for politics that would change society, and for exploring new cultural pursuits. And they took these passions with them into the ghettos that followed. Political parties set up theater groups and newspapers, organized soup kitchens, and held party meetings in the ghetto. And the fighters who led the ghetto uprising in Warsaw were members of the Zionist youth groups. Thank you for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed this. Here are some of the resources that I've used, and this will be posted on the Gombin Society website. Please explore other material about Gombin on our website and consider joining for the upcoming year or donating to make more activities like this possible. I'll see if there are any questions. I'm going to stop sharing and go back to full screen. Please feel free to send questions to the website, contact us through the Gombin Society website. I love to see that so many people are adding to the chat. This has been a pleasure for me to do this, and thank you so much for attending.